Ariel,
Yep.
I'm looking in Dropbox and I don't see the PowerPoints. Did you save them in PowerPoints?
Yeah, 24th March.
Ah, I just saw it now. Okay.
Yeah, got it. Cool.
Let me see. 24th March. Okay. Uh-huh. I got it. All right. And will we be given the right to upload?
Yes. So Morris, you'll be able to share your slides directly.
Okay. Let me see here. Take a look. So if I want to share screen, I think I got it. And you can see it now, right?
Yes, I can.
Okay,
Yeah,
great.
good. Lovely.
All right, I'll just stop share for a second. All right.
All right, we'll probably start in a minute or so.
Okay.
Morris, Ariel, we're trying to open the video and we'll start in probably 1 minute or so.
That's great. Thanks.
지금 그 유튜브와 우리 줌으로 지금 접속하신 분들께 안내 말씀드리면 지금 비디오 관련해서 조금 조치가 필요해서 그 조금 지연되고 있습니다. 곧 시작하도록 하겠습니다.
이게 마이크는 되는데 비디오만 안 되네.
예, 그 조치 중인 것 같습니다.
그러니까 좀 희한하구만. 윤주수 내 목소리는 잘 들려?
아, 예, 소리는 다 잘 들립니다.
오케이.
Ariel, Morris,
Yes.
our people are working with the video, but I think we can at least start the introduction with audio. So we'll begin and we'll proceed with introducing you after hearing Professor Lee's welcoming remarks. So we will start the session.
Okay.
지금 유튜브하고 줌으로 접속하신 모든 분들께 일단 환영 말씀을 드리고요. 비디오가 조금 조치가 안 되고 있는 거에 대해서 죄송하다는 말씀을 우선 드립니다. 조치되는 대로 바로 비디오를 활성화하도록 하겠습니다. 우선 이 서울대 경쟁법센터에서 주최하는 저자로부터 직접 듣는 북토크에 오신 것을 환영합니다. 오늘은 작년에 이제 출간이 되면서 화제를 모았던 Competition Overdose의 두 저자를 모시고 북토크를 진행하려고 합니다. 먼저 경쟁법센터를 이끌고 계시는 서울대학교 법학전문대학원의 이봉희 교수님 환영사 듣도록 하겠습니다. 예, 저희가 지금 이 비디오 관련된 그게 조금 에러가 있어서 조금 지연되고 있는데 조치되는 대로 바로 계속 진행하도록 하겠습니다.
내가 오디오를 안 켰었네. 다시 시작하겠습니다.
예, 부탁드립니다, 센터장님.
예. Hello everyone, I am Professor Lee and the Director of the Center for Competition Law, SNU. Nice to see you, Professor Stuckey and Professor E즈라키, and welcome to the book talk hosted by CCL. Thank you both for today's meaningful presentation, and also I give my thanks to Professor Lim for all the preparation of this webinar. From now on, for our audiences, I'll make some brief opening remarks in Korean. 안녕하십니까. 서울대학교 경쟁법센터장을 맡고 있는 이봉희 교수입니다. 오늘 경쟁법센터는 처음으로 북토크라는 형태의 세미나를 웨비나로 진행하게 되었습니다. 오늘 웨비나에서는 조금 전에 이문 교수께서 소개해 주신 바와 같이 지난 2020년 출간되어 화제를 모은 컴피티션 오버도스를 공동으로 저술한 모리스 스터키 교수와 에즈라키 교수께서 여러분들에게 경쟁이란 과연 절대 선인지, 지나친 경쟁 이데올로기가 우리 사회에 어떤 해악을 미칠 수 있는지와 같은 근본적인 질문을 미국과 유럽의 여러 사례를 들어가며 실감나게 전달해 줄 것으로 기대합니다. 사실 개인적으로 이 컴피티션 오버도스라는 책을 읽으면서 최근 우리나라의 문제 상황과 대조되는 느낌을 지울 수 없었습니다. 지난 4년간 현 정부에서 드러난 국가주의, 공공주도의 각종 경제 정책을 경험하면서 저는 우리나라의 시장 경제와 경쟁이 중대하게 위협받고 있다는 문제의식을 갖게 되었습니다. 지난 2000년대 이후 경험했던 신자유주의의 흐름이 국가주의로 바뀌는 데에는 그리 많은 시간이 걸리지 않았습니다. 이처럼 혼란스러운 상황에서 우리는 경쟁과 규제를 어떻게 조화시켜 나갈 것인지라는 근본적인 문제를 심각하게 고민하지 않을 수 없습니다. 우리나라의 역사와 문화, 경제 구조에 적합한 건전한 경쟁, 사운드 컴피티션이 과연 무엇인지, 이를 위한 경쟁법 집행의 원칙은 어떠해야 하는지 함께 모색해야 할 것입니다. 이러한 맥락에서 두 저자가 제안하고 있는 노블 컴피티션이라는 개념 내지는 컨셉은 상당히 저에게도 흥미로웠고 우리에게도 많은 영감과 시사점을 제공해 줄 것으로 기대합니다. 코로나 상황이 심각하여 스터키 교수와 에즈라키 교수 두 분을 직접 한국에 초대하지 못하고 부득이 웨비나로 강연을 듣게 된 것을 유감스럽게 생각합니다. 하지만 그럼에도 불구하고 오늘 이 북토크는 매우 유익한, 시의적절한 세미나가 될 것으로 확신합니다. 두 분 교수께 다시 한번 진심으로 감사드리고 마이크를 오늘 진행사를 맡은 이명 교수께 넘기도록 하겠습니다. Thank you very much.
네, 감사합니다, 센터장님. Maurice Ariel, I'll be briefly introducing you to the audience. 저자 소개를 잠시 하겠습니다. 두 분이 워낙 유명하셔서 사실 길게 소개해 드릴 필요도 없을 것 같은데 아리엘 에즈라키 교수님께서는 옥스포드 대학의 슬러터 앤 메이 경쟁법 교수이자 옥스포드 경쟁법 정책센터의 디렉터로 재직하고 계시고 Journal of Antitrust Enforcement의 공동 편집장이자 미국과 유럽 경쟁법 분야에서 많은 논문과 저술 작업을 하고 계십니다. 이제 연구 결과들이 당연히 톱 저널에 게재되는 것은 물론이고요. 이코노미스트라든지 뉴요커 월스트리트 저널, BBC 등을 포함한 다양한 매체를 통해서 소개된 바 있습니다. 모리스 슈트게 교수님께서는 테네시 대학의 더글래스 A. 블레이즈 법학 교수이시고요. 미 법무부의 검사를 포함해서 25년간의 경쟁법, 소비자보호법, 프라이버시 관련된 실무 경험을 쌓고 계십니다. 이 분야들의 전문가로서 다양한 국가의 정부 그리고 국제기구에 자문을 하고 계시고요. 에즈라키 교수님과 마찬가지로 디지털 경제에서의 경쟁과 관련하여 빅데이터 앤 컴피티션 policy 책을 포함해서 뛰어난 연구 업적을 계속 내고 계십니다. 사실 여러분들은 두 분이 전에 냈던 Virtual Competition의 공동 저자로 잘 알고 계실 텐데 작년에 냈던 신간 Competition Overdose를 오늘 저자들로부터 직접 얘기를 청해 듣도록 하겠습니다. Ariel, Morris, I think you can proceed.
Thank you so much, Professor Lim, Professor Lee. We very much appreciate the opportunity to present to you. So we will begin. The book and the essence of our research is about instances in which competition, which is of course extremely beneficial to all of us as a society, backfires. But it's very important for us to begin just by clarifying the starting point is that, of course, competition and competition enforcement play a significant role in our welfare. Competition brings us greater welfare, greater innovation, choice, quality. So what we do is certainly not challenge all the benefits of competition. What we're trying to highlight is that whereas competition is often beneficial, it is not always beneficial. And this comes out of us realizing at some point that whereas economists and specialists in antitrust and competition know the refinement, generally when it comes to policy making, competition law was elevated to some sort almost of a religious belief. The belief that anytime the state finds itself with a certain difficulty, the state outsources the problem to the free market, with the assumption that competition will generate wealth to everyone. And yet most of us feel very much like we're in a rat race. We're constantly being promised that competition law will deliver more and more, and yet we're not getting more welfare. We're working longer hours, and many times we feel that we are the victims of this overdose. So we view competition like medicine. It is something that works extremely well, but you have to handle it with care. You need to make sure that you avoid overdosing on this ideal of competition. So what we've done in the book is divided to three parts. And what we do is first, we try to map out instances in which competition can become toxic. And we explain how exactly this happens. When is it that the process of competition that promises to deliver so much actually fails? Then we look at those who push for greater rivalry, even when they actually know that in those specific instances, rivalry, competition will not deliver. And finally, we ask what we as a society can do about this, what we as individuals, companies, and of course, governments can do about this, so we all benefit from the dynamic of competition. So to begin, we'll run through some examples from the first part of the book. And Maurice, maybe you start by giving us an example of how competition can backfire, toxic competition.
Okay, thank you so much for this opportunity. So as Ariel mentioned, we look at what are the assumptions underlying competition and what happens when you relax some of those assumptions. So one assumption is that our individual interests and our collective interests are aligned. So one issue that we thought about is this is the last hockey player to ever play without a helmet in the National Hockey League. And you would ask, why would a hockey player go without wearing a helmet? It makes sense that you would wear a helmet because it could protect you from injuries to your head and brain injuries, concussions, and the like. Well, if you can imagine that if a hockey player thinks that they might have a competitive advantage by going without a helmet, they'll do that. And then all the other hockey players, so that they're not disadvantaged, will also go without a helmet. that collectively then they'll all be without a helmet and no one has a competitive advantage and they're all worse off. And you could then see that that's what's called a race to the bottom. So we first thought about hockey players, and then we said, well, what about instances where there's a race to the bottom that not only affects the players, like the hockey players, but also would affect the audience, would affect the consumer. And that brought us then to college rankings. So in the United States, as elsewhere, including Korea, it's very fierce, the competition to get into a top-ranked university. And the rankings can be very helpful because they can help the student as well as the family understand the different schools and their strengths and weaknesses. And it's many children's ambitions to get into a top-ranked school. So this is a letter to Genevieve, and Genevieve received this from the US University Tulane, which is a top-ranked university here. It's in New Orleans. And you could see here that this is a great letter, that whether it's your outstanding academics, countless hours of community service, portfolio of extracurricular activities, or your continued relationship with Tulane, you are an ideal candidate to apply. And not only are they encouraging Genevieve to apply, but they're going to then consider her for a partial scholarship, the opportunity to interview with an alum, and there's no application fee. So you could imagine that if your child, your son or daughter received a letter like this, you would be quite proud. I mean, you imagine that a top-ranked university is trying to encourage your child to come to their school. Well, who's Genevieve? As we talk in our book, Genevieve is my standard schnauzer. So why did a dog get invited to apply to a top-ranked university? Well, in the United States, one small component at that time was how many students applied and how many students were accepted. So the lower the acceptance rate, the more prestigious the university looked, and the higher then its ranking. So what competition, what the competition existed among the universities was to go out across the country and invite thousands of students to apply, knowing that only very few would be accepted. My wife and I were talking about this the other day, and the odds of being accepted into Stanford, Harvard, and other Ivy League, some of the other Ivy League universities is actually lower than getting COVID-19. Yet many people think, I'm not going to get COVID-19, but I have a shot to get into Harvard. And the colleges prey on that. So not only did Genevieve get an invitation from Tulane, but she also got invitations to the University of Chicago. She was invited to apply to many of the other top universities, and they all played on that same thing. And you could see here that it really doesn't benefit the colleges because it's not getting them a better application pool. Certainly doesn't help the students because it crushes them when they get the rejection letter. And a few of the top schools, including Harvard, tried to stop it. They said, you know what, we're going to opt out and we're going to stop with this early admission process that was really handicapping the students. And what they found was they couldn't. That even a university with a powerful brand as Harvard could not stop this toxic competition. So you might think, okay, that's a peculiarity of the US and its education system. And that might be, one example of an arms race. We understand that, but that's rather unique. are there other examples of where too much competition might backfire? And this takes us then to a curious story that happened in the EU.
Okay, so another area where you can really see a problem is that of quality. Generally, when we speak about competition, our base assumption is that as you increase competition, we as consumers will benefit from lower prices, greater quality, and better service. And the reason for that is that we make certain assumptions about the competition machine. We assume that there is a good flow of information, and we assume that sellers will communicate to us any problems with quality or service elsewhere, and that other customers will communicate to us the same things. So because of that, there is an ongoing assumption that if you want to benefit society, increase the pressure of competition. But reality, of course, is less impressive. And what really happens is that sometimes the competition machine doesn't work well. And one of the examples of quality degradation in the EU was the Horsegate scandal. And what was that about? We had fierce competition between supermarkets, which is generally good. Those supermarkets increased the pressure they put on their beef suppliers. The beef suppliers increased the pressure they put on their suppliers to provide them with cheaper beef. And what happened was that for some suppliers, the option was either find a way to lower the price or be pushed out of the market, get out of business. And what they found is that horse meat was much cheaper. So they started to outsource horse meat and basically mix it with beef. Some beef packages actually included 100% diced horse meat rather than beef meat. And this is a really nice example because everyone thinks that they benefit from the competitive process. The supermarkets, the customers, and yet customers pay less, but get much less than what they expected. And the whole thing exploded at some point when there was a review of the quality of the beef, and it was discovered that there is horse DNA, and then it was discovered that this is across the board in the food chain. Now, the important thing to appreciate, this is not unique. You have it when it comes to additives. You have it when it comes to fish. You have it when it comes to spices. Quality degradation is one of the easiest safety valves, the easiest ways to release pressure without making it noticeable, because in practice, markets just don't work as well as we expect them to. Now, if you think, okay, this is unique to the food chain, I mean, on the slide you see in front of you, we have a completely different example. This is an example of quality degradation that actually resulted in horrendous consequences. The two crashes of the Boeing 737 MAX can be attributed also to fierce competition between Airbus and Boeing. What happened at the time is that Boeing was about to lose a very significant deal to Airbus, and it reached an agreement with one of the leading airlines in the US that they will deliver a new airplane that will compete with the Airbus Neo, and that airplane will have greater capacity. But the key issue was that Boeing promised that there will be no need to train pilots on this new airplane. To achieve that, Boeing then increased the pressure on its own engineers as they develop the airplane to make sure that they do not introduce anything that will necessitate training that will take more than 1 hour on an iPad. And when the engines had to be tweaked a little bit, and when they realized that the airplane will stall and they put in a new automated program, they just did not inform the pilots. So this is really interesting. We have an assumption that because of the cost of downgrading quality, companies will not do those things. And yet in practice, something that is worth billions in terms of risk still happened. And you would be right to ask, so where is the US Federal Aviation Administration? Well, they as well put their trust in competition. They assume that the competition machine will deliver. So they outsource the function that they're supposed to have, which is make sure that the airplanes are at the highest quality, and they gave it to Boeing. Basically, Boeing self-certifies its own airplanes. So it's really interesting when we get hooked on the narrative that competition will always deliver. This can really backfire if we don't understand the nuances and when markets actually can truly fail. Maurice, next slide.
Yeah, so go ahead, Art.
No. I mean, maybe to complete the picture, we'll look at another type of failure.
So, like Ariel was mentioning about the airline, and it was really interesting that Ariel sent me the other day this report by the International Monetary Fund. They're working with Ariel on his upcoming seminar that he's going to be providing at Oxford. And Ariel is doing some interesting work on income inequality and antitrust. But in the report, we both found really interesting was that with financial institutions, the IMF also pointed out how intense competition among banks can lead them to engage in risky behavior that could actually undermine the economy. And so it's a different type of quality, but it increases then risk-taking. That fierce competition can encourage risk-taking. And so you could see that quality degradation not only with food, but with financial institutions. It could also lead to environmental degradation, and also what we point out, human slavery. So in the third overdose, we look at competition to exploit us rather than benefit us. And here, if you've studied economics, and particularly the neoliberal economic theory, there are certain assumptions about individuals that you learn in your Econ 101 class. And here that market participants are rational. They can perfectly calculate their utility. They have perfect willpower so that they can then align their choices with increasing what maximizes then their utility, and that they primarily pursue their own self-interest. And what we've seen with behavioral economics is that's not often the case, right? That we may want to be leaner, we might want to eat healthier, we all promise to exercise more, and sometimes we do and sometimes we don't. So you can see then competition when we're not perfectly rational, when we have these biases and heuristics, and when we have imperfect willpower, that competition can either help us, but alternatively, it could also be used to exploit us. And one example that we provide in our book is what's called drip pricing. And you might see this when you go online to book a hotel. And this is here with the Trump Resorts in Las Vegas. So after this presentation, go onto a website and try to book a hotel for a Las Vegas casino. Maybe try Circus Circus. And what you might see when you go online is a very low price. And you might think, oh, that's wonderful. Once the COVID-19 lifts, I'll go to Circus Circus. Now, if you were then going to try to book a room, what you'll see then is as you continually click through, after you select the dates and you start clicking through, watch what happens to your price. When we did it last, the price of a room in Circus Circus, I believe, started off around, I think, $30. By the time that we were ready to check out, it was double. It was almost $60. And this is called drip pricing. And it's well known, the Federal Trade Commission in the United States brought together academics, market participants, and they wanted to understand better. And they said, well, drip pricing is a mechanism to exploit us. It lures us with a low initial price, and then it just adds, like dripping of a faucet, all of these price increases until you check out. And it preys on a particular form of bias by humans. So in other jurisdictions like Australia, they banned it. But in the United States, they were going to take action, but they didn't. The FTC didn't. And why? Interestingly enough, the lobbyists from the most powerful casinos said competition. And we actually had one casino that took a stand, just like Harvard, and they fought initially against drip pricing. But they too then recognized they could make more profits from exploiting us than rather trying to then help us. And so they too now are engaging in drip pricing. In fact, they're one of the worst culprits about that. And this is nothing unusual. The use of these biases and heuristics. One bias is default bias, that whatever the default is, we're more likely going to stick. If you want people to contribute their organs, you make then being an organ donor as the default. If you want people to save for retirement accounts, you make that as a default. And one of the key issues in the Google case is Google paying billions of dollars each year to be the default search engine on Apple devices. So we have 4 overdoses, and you might think each one is peculiar, but once you start looking at the underlying assumptions and you start looking around you, you might then realize there's a lot more toxic competition than what you originally might have perceived. So that led us then to the second question: who's pushing this toxic competition? And that leads probably to one of the more sinister players in our book, and these are the game makers. So Ariel, who are they?
Yeah, so one of the things is that we realize is that even before we look at the game makers, that when you ask yourself, how come if economists are aware of the warning labels, if people in the know, educated people, familiar with some of the problems when you just increase and intensify competition, how come we still have this fierce competition? And we go through several groups, lobbyists, large corporations that push this ideal. Now, sometimes they'll be right to do so, but sometimes they do it in a way where it can only benefit them. But what they do is they wrap the idea of more competition and less regulatory intervention, which could work very often, but they wrap it in a way that will really only benefit them and will cost us as society. So we go through quite a lot of examples of how this happens and how you can capture the regulation, how you can capture the ideology. But then we reach those game makers. This is an image from the Hunger Games. So the idea that there is one place where you can not only try to influence it, you control competition. And that place happens when you look at the leading platforms, when you look at Facebook, for example, or Google. And this is really unique because what you have there is an opportunity for someone to create competition from the start. Because of course, you can look at Google and Facebook as dominant companies and understand them in the context of powerful companies that operate on a wider market, or you can view them as the controllers of little autonomies, where they control the patterns of demand and supply. They control those who can enter the market, and they control those who exit the market. And in those realities, the invisible hand of competition basically give way to a digitalized hand of competition. It is very much like the Truman Show. It is the ability to control all the aspects of competition. And interestingly, when you can control all the aspects of competition, what type of competition will you create on your playing field. What will be the type of competition that you will advance? And as we looked into that, we realized that many times the competition that the game makers will advance will be toxic, because what they will do is they will harness rivalry between users or between sellers, not to benefit the market and society, but actually to benefit themselves. Their aim is to try and make sure that they capture as much of the value as possible. So to give you just an example of how they do it, for example, they engage a lot of the time in an attempt to hook us as much as possible, try and get us as much as possible to spend more and more time online. They try to do so because it enables them to extract as much data as they can. And then they sell that data, or they attract bidders when it comes to advertisers. And in that system, you would say, if you look, for example, at one segment, the advertisers, you will be right to say, but this looks extremely competitive. I have bids every millisecond. And yet, if you look at $1 at the top of the market, and you see how much of it is actually reaching the publisher, the website, you realize that much of the value disappears along the way and goes to the game maker. So it's very interesting that if you have the control over the ecosystem and there is no intervention that actually forces you to make sure that the environment will work in order to service the greater good, you will very quickly find yourself drifting into increasing toxicity, because toxicity tends to serve one of the parties rather than serve everyone as a whole. Okay, so these are the people that push it. I mean, we have plenty of examples in the book. We also look at privatization. We look at cream skimming, a lot of concepts. But the question then for all of us is, okay, we understand that you need to be nuanced when you speak about competition, but what can we do about it? What is it that we can do in order to ensure that competition actually works to serve us? And one of the things that we've done is we created this spectrum where you can see different types of competition. So the first thing you can do is, in many ways, first of all, move away from this binary idea that you either have competition, which is always good, or you have nothing. In reality, you have different types of competition. You have different qualities of competition. On the left, you see the example of toxic competition, where in a way, everyone loses except maybe for the game maker. But you can move along the spectrum, and then you have zero-sum competition. This is motivated by self-interest, which is perfectly fine many times. If I bid for something and Maurice bid for the same thing, it is in many ways a competition between the two of us. Only one of us will win. Sometimes you can have positive sum competition where everyone wins, society wins, the individual wins. You can really see how competition serves us. And we came up with a concept that we call noble competition, which even goes beyond that. And the idea here is that as you compete, you do so in a system that tries really to capture most of the benefit of competition. And Maurice will later explain a bit more about the concept of noble competition. But at this stage, the important thing to understand is that if you ask people, what kind of capitalism do you want? We all understand the value of capitalism. We all understand that we benefit from free markets. But free markets left to their own will not necessarily deliver the optimal outcome when it comes to society. And you see here a study that was conducted very recently, and you see how people actually favor a type of capitalism that has some sort of responsibility. So even intuitively, we all understand that we want free markets, we want fierce competition, but we would like someone to help us navigate the competition, navigate the incentives, so they will benefit society. After all, if you go back to the beginning of economic theory, The reason we promote competition is because we have an underlying assumption that when each of us is promoting his or her own interests, we also benefit society at large. So let's talk a little bit more about this idea of noble competition, the idea that which is really more relevant when it comes to the state as the designer of a competition landscape that tries to get the most out of it. Maurice, maybe you can elaborate on that.
So when we thought about what would be the ideal of competition, if you were the game maker, if you were to design the competitive process, what would you ultimately want? And we put it just quite simply, that noble competition is helping your rivals reach their full potential. And here's a picture of two runners, Rayford Johnson and C.K. Yang. And we like this because they were friends. They were very close friends. They both went to the same college. And they each pushed the other to achieve their best. And Johnson narrowly beat Yang for the gold medal. But you could see here that why one working harder made the other work even more hard. And you could see the same thing if you have, children and they're competing against one another. You wouldn't want toxic competition where one, where one takes steroids in order to get an advantage over the other. Nor would you want the competition to be zero sum, that when one child does better, that means that your other child is doing worse. You would want each child to help push the other so that they each then achieve their maximum potential. And from a societal perspective, that's what we want from competitors. We want competitors to push each other so that they then bring out their best. And here you could then see that competition does two things. Competition serves us rather than our serving competition. And also competition brings out your best rather than your worst. So when we first brought this concept of noble competition, helping your rivals reach their full potential, one of our friends said cynically, well, aren't you really talking about cartels? And this is a quote from an actual cartel involving ADM, a US company, where the executive said, our competitors are our friend, our customers are the enemy. And isn't what you're arguing here about noble competition, rivals reaching their full potential, really just cartels? And it isn't. No one argues that cartels are even competition. It's the avoidance of competition. But if you put your perspective as the game maker, you would want then companies in pushing each other to deliver their best. And that's nothing to do with cartels. So then the question is, well, that's very esoteric. How would we apply this noble competition? And what we discovered is that we all have a role to play. So first is the state's role. Is the government has to then recognize a couple things. First, you can't just unleash competition and expect it to work. There are times that there are going to need to be guardrails to prevent, let's say, exploitative competition or the quality degradation that Ariel talked about, for example, with the food. The other thing is you have to recognize that competition doesn't always lead to the fair and just outcome. Competition can provide an efficient outcome, but there always will be a gap. And that's where the government has a role to play. So let's say to provide a safety net for its market participants when they come up short. So this is a picture by Norman Rockwell. And he had President Franklin D. Roosevelt. And one of the four key freedoms that FDR identified was the freedom of want. And that later became part of the charter for the United Nations, is to provide at times the basic services that competition cannot provide. But there's also an important role for companies. And there's two things that we discovered. First, employees want to work for a company that does more than just generate profits or maximizes shareholder value. They want companies that have a social purpose. And they're going to actually, companies that have a social purpose, as the Harvard Business Review and others have found, actually do better than companies that just seek to maximize shareholder value. The second important thing is, if you're an executive at a company, you might think, well, if competition is great, why don't we unleash competition within the firm? Why don't we have divisions compete against one another? And you could do so, but you need to apply the same warning labels that Ariel identified early on. And we have in our book an example about Enron. And we also have some important studies that talk about the shortcomings of unleashing competition within the firm that we would recommend. And then finally is our role. And think about it. For many of you in the audience, you competed tirelessly to get into a good university. Then once you were in the university, you competed to get good grades, to get a good job. Then you're competing then within your job to move up the ranks. And you might then say to yourself, I'm in this rat race, and I don't really sense that competition is serving me. And I think it's important then for us at times to step back and say, to what extent am I contributing to this rat race? What type of competition am I competing in? And can I choose at times not to compete, let's say, in the toxic forms of competition? Can I bow out of that? But there will be instances where you can't. That, if you want to apply to a US university, you're in this, unfortunately, in this toxic competition. So one thing that we point out is dissent. And we have these famous experiments in America by Stanley Milgram, which were ostensibly about learning, but they really wanted to see people's obedience. Would they apply electric shocks? You can see here the shock measure to the subject. And they brought people in and they wanted to see, would they administer a 450 volt shock to an individual? And most people, this was in the 1960s, most people said no. Only like a few crazy individuals would do that. But what they found was that most people actually administered the shock. But one important variable was dissent. If one of the other participants in the study, and that was part of the design, objected, then most participants would not go any further. And if one of the lab technicians also objected, that had a strong influence. So I think there's, for us, an opportunity to look at competition and not to have this reflexive attitude that, oh, if it's competitive, it must be good. So one objective that we have is just to pause when someone says it's pro-competitive, to not automatically think it's good. And then the second is to look at our environment and look at what type of competition is it? Is it the healthy type of competition? Is it zero sum? Can we move it to positive sum? And can we move it to noble? And can we avoid the toxic forms of competition that can really have a detrimental impact on our autonomy and on our well-being? Ariel, do you have some closing observations?
I think maybe we can, if people have questions, we can discuss them. One thing that is really interesting that we came across was actually the pandemic, and it was very interesting and unfortunate in a way to see how this brought so many aspects of toxic and overdose into the game. So we saw at the beginning how mismanagement, for example, in the United States, of how to acquire ventilators or PPEs really led to society losing out. And that was mostly because the federal government did not take a role. There was a certain over-reliance on the private sector. And that was quite interesting because private sector, of course, has a massive role to play. But what you saw is that if you just unleash competition with no attempt to help competition deliver, it doesn't really work well. And on the other hand, we saw collaborations between scientists that very much resembled the idea of a greater good. Scientists compete against each other. In academia, people compete against each other, but people saw the need to achieve something which is greater than their own benefit, while trying to advance their own benefit as well. And that was very interesting. We've done some writing about this, but I think once you become aware of the nuances of competition, you can really look around you and get a very good sense of whether competition is serving you or not. And many times also get a sense of whether those who promote competition do it when they are in the right, or when they possibly are just using it as a narrative that is very easy to sell because we are all primed to favor capitalism, but in a way they do it in a distorted manner. But we'll be delighted to hear questions or comments and comment back.
Thank you, Ariel Morris. That was wonderful. And I should tell you that I really enjoyed the book. I also liked that it seemed to end on an optimistic note and the belief that we could do better. There are already a few questions posed by the audience, and so I'll start right away. The first question was, the person that posed the question said that he agreed with your point that competition should benefit the broader society. He questioned whether that role, though, should be played by competition law or should it be played by other law, and was curious as to what your prescription would be between the different laws. Maybe I can add a question that I had also. When you talk about the competition and potential, its potential to be realized on an individual level, it dawned upon me, what about companies? I mean, does this mean that we also need to rethink, in some cases, about overhauling corporate law and governance regimes, for example? And so if you could answer that question.
Certainly, and these are really, really good questions. I mean, I'll make a few comments, and I'm sure Maurice will then have additional comments from his perspective. First of all, in terms of how to achieve it, there are many different policy avenues that you can deploy. But if you look at our modern society and our the main principles and ideologies that support much of our society, they are based on the idea of competition delivering. So we have a basic assumption that competition will deliver. And what we try to do is to reorient the discussion. And to be clear, when we discuss noble competition, we don't, just as Maurice said, we don't try to suggest that you will not compete fiercely. Noble competition in many ways is like perfect competition. Those of you familiar with the economic model, that it's an ideal, but it doesn't exist. Noble competition as well is an ideal. It is not something that I should take on board when I compete against someone. I compete to win. But if the person that designed the boundaries of competition, designed them with the ideal of noble competition, they would have made sure that I compete effectively to benefit the others. So I'll give you an example. If we spoke about the beef, so how do you turn competition into noble? For instance, by having better control over quality of beef by the state, or when companies such as Marks and Spencer, Tesco, leading supermarkets in the UK Waitrose realized that the state actually failed to fulfill its function in that respect and over-relied on competition, what they have done is they created their own enhanced scrutiny. And now when you buy a packet of beef, let's say at Marks and Spencer, you know exactly which cow it came from in which farm. So this is them reacting. So what they're doing is they're saying, we want lower prices, but we suffer. If competition backfires and we sell you horse meat, we suffer as well because you will not trust us. Trust is a function of competitive markets. And maybe last comment, when we met with one of the economists, and Maurice mentioned it briefly, he told us, you know, competition is an odd thing because it's not all it's cracked up to be, in the sense that we assume that it will deliver all the societal benefits, but what it can deliver, even when it works really well, is efficiency. So very much so, you need to supplement it with additional safeguards or additional values. And indeed, if you look at your jurisdiction, any other jurisdiction, we try to advance values in parallel and hope that together they will achieve something. The key from where we stand is to just understand that part of those values can be achieved through reconfiguration of the competition ideal. And even more important than that, much more efficiency, much more benefit can be achieved through the competition machinery if you understand it better and you know how to operate it.
Yeah, I would just add to on the corporate law aspect is two things. Lynn Stout, who is a professor I had, and she talked about the myth of shareholder value, that there's nothing in US corporate law that dictates that a company has to maximize shareholder value, and that's the only purpose of the firm. So one area for corporate law is to look at what is a corporation's purpose and not to dictate that it has like the sole purpose just to maximize money for the shareholders, because that could actually lead to toxic competition. And then the second, I think, is a role for companies themselves is how can they promote an ethical organizational culture? And we talk a little bit about that in our book. And we have some ideas, but that would be another important concept.
Thank you. I'll move on to the second question. Maybe I can phrase it in this manner. In your view, is toxic competition endemic in the digital economy, or is it prevalent in certain sectors or markets? Now, another following question might be, if so, why is competition more toxic in such sectors? So is this more of a general or systemic plague, or disease concentrated in some parts of systems that can be cornered or treated? A follow-up question was, you talk much about the Trump administration and maybe comparing that with different administrations. Does this sort of problem of toxic competition or drinking the Kool-Aid is particularly associated with a particular administration, or is it the same under the current administration in the U.S.?
Okay, so let me take a lead on that. So with respect to the digital environment, it is endemic in markets involving behavioral advertising, where advertising is basically targeting the individual. And Ariel and I are now working on a new book, and we explore this further about how this toxic competition can actually lead to toxic innovation. So just be on the lookout for that, but it is endemic. In fact, it's even worse than what we originally thought when we wrote the Game Makers chapter. And then the second is this Trump didn't help with his casinos, with the Trump hotel and drip pricing. And actually, Trump, in some ways, exploited the harms that what we see in the digital economy, in that it's not just even behavioral advertising, it's the competition to addict us, and it's the competition to manipulate us. And he just took advantage of these platforms. But these platforms are doing this in other contexts as well. I mean, you think about like TikTok, YouTube, and you just look at how much time they consume of particularly among younger people. And it's not by accident, it's by design. So he was able to feed into a lot of like the raw emotions. So he was in a way, you know, the divisiveness, like some have argued that Facebook creates fight clubs, that that dissent attracts us. It actually is a mechanism that Facebook uses in order to increase our attention. So it's not something unique to Trump, but Trump was one who could exploit it. And he did it. He was an okay person in doing it. But you can imagine that someone in the future is going to say that there's even ways to perfect this. So it's not going to go away. It's not something that was just with Trump. And you're going to see, particularly with the game makers, people are going to design a competitive process to ensure that they can always come out ahead. And if you can create that process, and you can always say that, you know, regardless of who wins or loses, I'm going to profit significantly as a result. That type of game maker, if they have that opportunity, will use it and exploit it to their advantage. And Ariel talked about Facebook and Google, but you can see these game makers in other parts of the economy as well.
Well, I look forward. Oh, Ariel, do you want to add anything?
Maybe just two comments. I think with respect to the digital economy, there are, of course, a lot of areas in the digital economy where you see real benefit of competition. I think where it is really an issue, just as Maurice said, is when you look at the platform economy, and that has a lot to do with the idea of the game makers. But if you look at the innovation elsewhere and competition elsewhere in the digital economy at large, I wouldn't want to suggest that you will find it everywhere. And just like the spectrum that we showed on the slide, you can take that and project it on different markets. So, you know, there is now increased digitalization in pharma, there is increased digitalization in so many other areas. And this is, let's say, an industry-specific observation. I think the important thing when you think about the game makers is that if someone comes back to you when you raise concerns as to what they're doing, and does so by suggesting that this is competitive, if our natural tendency in the past has been to take a step back and say, oh, sorry, I challenged you. No, you should challenge them, because not everything that is competitive is necessarily acceptable. I sometimes give the examples to my students that in some quarters, in some places, you can imagine, you know, the police arriving to an alley and seeing a dead body and someone standing above it with a knife, and they say, hands up, and say, no, it's okay, it was pro-competitive. That shouldn't be the case. If someone is engaging in something that is obviously harmful to society, we shouldn't have that vision that pro-competitive is some sort of a defense line that can just enable you to do everything. Competition has its variations, and it's absolutely essential that we become much more nuanced in our public discussion.
I really do look forward to reading the new book that's going to come out. we do have a few additional questions, particularly with regard to what the EU is doing. And since we had some delay in starting the session, if you, Ariel and Mars, are okay, we'll spend a few more minutes. I understand that it's already over nearly 70 minutes, but if that's okay, we'll entertain a few more questions. The question was your views on the current sustainability initiatives in the EU, specifically whether the concept of noble competition supported the idea that 101 enforcement should be relaxed to promote the so-called green agreements between rivals. Your views on that?
Yeah. And again, another excellent question. So thank you very much. First of all, to be clear, what we discuss is not competition law as such, but we discuss the dynamics of competition. So our focus, our discussion is not about the level of intervention necessarily. It goes to something which is much more central to our understanding of the process. But of course, as we do that, we also look at the level of enforcement. I think the idea of sustainability relates to the question of when you try to enforce competition, is that the only value? And that goes to the heart of what competition law is about. In Europe, this is a real interesting and quite passionate debate that we have at the moment on whether European competition law should balance between different values. In the context of sustainability, the question, for example, is, should we condemn the effort by companies that might limit competition but yield another benefit? So already by saying limit competition, you see that it's a slightly different question from that of enhanced competition, but it does fit into that, because if you appreciate that there are other values, if you appreciate that just by advancing efficiency, you will not necessarily promote the societal interest, then you realize that you need to have a wider toolbox. You need to include more values. The real challenge is, how do you balance between them? How do you actually create a prioritization that enables you, on one hand, to promote competition, on the other hand, to promote other values? And this is the lively debate that we have, both specifically for sustainability. We have a similar debate now when it comes to labor rights, and we have a wider policy debate, which is, should competition law advance multitude of interests, or should it be limited to very limited scope? Some people say, is it the case that only what we can measure should matter to us when we apply competition law? Or is it, and that would lead us to very narrow efficiency argument? Or is it the case that we understand that we have a concept that can be utilized to advance wider goals, and try then to inject some analytical certainty to the way that we apply it?
Thank you. There are a few additional questions. Maybe I'll combine two of them together. And I think this goes to perhaps some of the pushback that your friends in competition circles might have provided earlier to you. So how would you respond to those that argue from a jurisprudence perspective that noble competition suffers from the same drawbacks of arbitrariness and uncertainty that plagues notions of fair competition? A similar and maybe related concern might be, if we pursue noble competition or positive sum competition, are we actually replacing abusive private game makers with inept government game masters? And so I think you did actually note in your book and mention some issues with government regulation and perhaps the related costs. But I think maybe if you could respond to some this sort of pushback from people in competition law circles.
Yeah, so I mean, well, we're not talking about, this is, this, when we had this discussion about it, some people then say, well, aren't you then arguing for socialism, right? And then the other thing is that fairness, right? Fairness is, oh my gosh, once we say fairness, that's so subjective. Everyone has their own view of what's fair or unfair. Well, first off, I would push back on the notion that fairness is arbitrary. That if you actually look at the research, and we discussed some of it in our book, that in many societies, people have a concept of fairness. There's a norm of what's fair or what's not fair. In fact, if you look at the ultimatum game and some of the other games that we point out, and you actually find a correlation that where people, first of all, and the literature is quite robust on this when they play the ultimatum game, is that there is this notion of what's a fair outcome. And the other thing is the notion that competition has to be somehow zero sum, has to be warfare in order for us to prove, is empirically suspect. In fact, there isn't as much literature on this subject, but what there is also draws that into dispute. So we address that concern in our book. And I think actually you can't just say fair. I agree. You need to have some sort of implementation. But then the second thing is, yes, there might be the risk of the government overreaching. But right now, we have probably the worst of all possible worlds when you think about it in many developed economies, is you have this laissez-faire notion of competition where you have a market power problem. So you have monopolies and oligopolies. So you have too little healthy competition on one side. And then what remains of that competition is often toxic. So you have the sort of behavioral exploitation, you have the quality degradation, you have the use of the choice overload to exploit us. And then you also have this arms race where we're perpetually engaged in this struggle to get ahead, beat our rivals, and we're all worse off. I mean, you just look at the, one thing that's really interesting is like, why is it that with the college admissions scandal that happened in the US, it wasn't the poor or the middle class even that were embroiled, but it was the wealthiest. It was like not even the top 1%, but the top 0.1%. Why did they push so hard to get their children into these top universities when they themselves didn't go to the top universities? Why was it so important to get into Harvard or Yale or Georgetown or Stanford? It's because they realize how precarious today's economy is. We live on this knife's edge, the fear that if our children don't get into the right school, they're doomed. And with automation coming and so many more jobs, middle management jobs, likely to be chopped. Like Ariel and I were talking with our book about how this one person was training an algorithm to replace her and how dehumanizing that must be. And we realize this for our children. Then the status quo is just unacceptable. I mean, no one is getting ahead in this world on that model. A few will profit, but the rest of us are just going to be scrambling just to get a little bit better than our neighbor so we don't fall into that abyss. And so what we're saying is that that doesn't have to be the reality. We can choose something better. And yeah, there might be risks of government capture, but right now the government is captured with the laissez-faire doctrines that haven't worked to improve our well-being.
I'll just add three short comments. One, we absolutely are aware of the risk of government error, and the last thing we would argue for is, you know, a market that is controlled by the state. That's not the story. The story is, the counterfactual is a better competitive market, and in a better competitive market, you need to balance. You need to have some government intervention, but not government that will replace it. But the first question has an assumption in it, and I think, which I find really interesting, because it has an assumption of neutrality, that if the government will not intervene, then the market forces will have their natural powers and will just bring us the joy that we're promised. And this is, I think, not an accurate representation of the reality. The market without the government is not neutral. The market that you have has already been affected by legislation, by lobbying, by previous monopolies, by state intervention. The winners that you have are not necessarily efficient. The information flows are not necessarily optimal. So the idea is that without the government, then we have the ideal. I think it's slightly misleading. And I find it, and I accept that ideal, and I accept why a lot of people mention it, because there is so much money that is being channeled to propagate that ideal. And that, I think, is the really interesting and quite astonishing thing. Those who promote the competition ideal, as we understand it, the general competition ideal that you see in society, are actually monopolies. It is the monopolies that all the time promote the competition ideal and tell you how competition is wonderful and the state should have a minimal impact. Just think about it. It doesn't make any sense unless the ideal that you promote is detached from reality. Because what they do is, behind the idea of the competition ideal, what they basically say is laissez-faire, no intervention. And that would be very much the correct thing to do if you had a competitive market. But if that's what you do in a market that is already controlled by large corporations, then you didn't achieve anything. All you've done is enable them to continue and extract value and increase the profit margins. So I think we have to be critical on the way the competition ideal is utilized. So many times there is capture. There's been some releases in the US on how some universities, very heavily sponsored by very and outside the US, and they will fly you business class to a resort somewhere, and they will teach you the idea of laissez-faire, which works perfectly well in a competitive market, and yet it is sponsored by a monopoly that is teaching it to judges and policymakers, so they will then apply it in a market that is already distorted. And that is astonishing. We shouldn't accept that. This is a complete distortion of the notion of competition, and it is basically allowing powerful companies to capture the narrative and engage in both ideological and regulatory capture.
As we wrap up, Ariel, Morris, I'm going to give two questions to you so that you can choose whichever to respond. And it's actually two questions that I wanted to ask. I should note that there was a question about privatization from one of our YouTube viewers. I believe if you read the book, you would probably, there's extensive discussion about privatization and its relation to the theme in the book. And I think the book would adequately cover that question. So final question and closing remarks on your behalf. So the first question touches upon and is related to your reference to a crisis of confidence in our institutions, I think at the end of your book. So does this lack of trust within societies, the internal strife and tension that we see today between segments within societies, according to maybe even race, wealth, etc., pose a challenge to enlisting conditional cooperators and fostering the noble competition you espouse? So that's the first question. The second question I had was the current discussion surrounding Google and Apple's recent efforts to strengthen privacy by restricting cookies and laying down ground rules related to privacy in the App Store, for example. So this has prompted its own controversy about restricting competition. Should we view this as a positive move towards noble competition? And perhaps your views on that. So with that and your final comments, please.
I mean, I know we're short on time, so I'll pick up the second question and just say it's really interesting. We all value privacy, but we should all accept that sometimes privacy and competition may create friction in between them. So, of course, when it comes to third-party cookies, there is a good argument against enabling excessive harvesting of data, misleading, abusing, manipulating users. There's also a parallel argument that the leading platforms that have the benefit of first-party tracking, because we sit on the platform, are using these privacy-enhancing measures in order to kill the competition. So what they do is, under the pretense of promoting our interest, they are actually bringing in, and there is now a new protocol that Google is proposing that will really lead to phasing out third-party cookies. And Google, in its own press release, confirms that there is no need for that anymore, because at this stage, it can actually reach the same level of targeting without using these third-party cookies. So it's a double-edged sword. It's something that you can see the benefit, but you can also see how those in position of power can very often utilize things in a way that promotes them. It's true to the GDPR, it's true to e-privacy. There are many aspects that we see how a company takes something that was meant to promote overall welfare and utilize it in a strategic manner to benefit itself even more. So, I mean, that's just the reality we live in. And we, because of that, when we think about regulation, when we think about behavior, we have to think about smart regulation, about dynamic regulation, about the ability to adjust to market happenings, and not just put out there something that very quickly become out of date and can be manipulated. I'll end with that, and thank you again for the opportunity.
Yeah, so there's a forthcoming book on breaking away that talks about the competition privacy divide. So that should come out, I think, the end of this year, and looks at, the original thought was that privacy and competition were unrelated. Then second was that privacy and competition are complementary. And then third is this privacy competition divide. With respect to the crisis in confidence, yes, I absolutely think now there's a crisis in confidence. In fact, it's not, I mean, if you look at a lot of the survey data, trust in our institutions has dropped to all-time lows in the United States. Trust in our politicians is even lower. Trust in a lot of the big tech platforms has declined as well significantly. And a lot of the historic institutions, for example, like religious institutions, universities, they're also now under attack. And we're really now in this world of a lot of zero-sum warfare and toxic competition. And we've kind of lost this view of what, society is about. It's like society, we didn't, competition at the end of the day is just a tool. It's just the means for some greater end. It's often a very good tool. And it's not a homogeneous tool. that when we say competition, it's not like comes in one particular format. So I think our leaving, if we could do anything, if for those who are listening to this podcast, would be, I think if we could accomplish at least 3 things today, then we would be happy. Number one, when someone says competition, like Ariel mentioned, just have a moment, pause. If we can just get at least a couple seconds where you might say, is that necessarily pro-competitive? Second, when someone says, let's use competition, to ask what type of competition, not to think of it as just monolithic, but along that spectrum. And then third, ask who is promoting this competition. And then when they're saying, oh, let's leave it to competition, to say, well, is this the type of competition that will actually benefit us, or are we serving it? And is this the type of competition that's going to bring out our best rather than our worst? So if we could get those 3 things through this book, then I think we've accomplished as much as what we can do. Thank you.
Thank you, Ariel Morris. I'm sure that everyone that reads the book will get those 3 points, and I think those are wonderful points. Thank you again for entertaining the questions. It's been nearly 90 minutes. I'm sure that everyone enjoyed the talk and your answers as much as I did. And I will now wrap up this session in Korean. 시청하신 모든 분들께 감사드리고요. 비디오에 약간의 문제가 있어가지고 이렇게 오디오로만 진행하게 된 것을 매우 죄송스럽게 생각합니다. 다음에도 또 좋은 이벤트와 시리즈로 찾아뵙도록 하겠습니다. 자, 그러면 우리 저자들에게 감사드리고요. 오늘 저녁도 편안하게 보내시기 바랍니다. 감사합니다. Thank you, Ariel Morris. We'll wrap up.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Next time, offline.
We hope so, in person.
Yeah, I hope so.
Absolutely,
yeah.
absolutely.
Thank you. Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye now.
임 교수 고생 많이 했어.